Since August 1944, the sea was calm that morning. Deceptively calm, like the kind of silence that comes before a scream. Somewhere in the Pacific, far from home, the crew of the smallest destroyer in the fleet, USS Rattlesnake, prepared for another routine patrol. She was small, not much bigger than a merchant vessel, and a joke to many in the Navy, just 260 feet long, barely armed with a few torpedoes, depth charges, and a single rapid-fire cannon that jammed half the time. But her size hid a spirit unlike anything the Japanese Navy had prepared for. The war in the Pacific had turned into a deadly chess match, and submarines were the deadliest pieces on the board. Japanese sub-commanders, stealthy and patient, had sunk entire convoys in the last 3 weeks. Morale was plummeting. Nobody trusted the water anymore. Whispers about death from below crept through every ship. And then came Rattlesnake. And her skipper, Commander Jack Weller. Jack wasn't what you'd expect from a man in charge of a warship. He was rough-edged, with a Chicago accent that never softened even under pressure. Most officers laughed behind his back when he took command of the Rattlesnake, calling it a punishment posting. He didn't care. "I didn't join this war to sip coffee in a damn cruiser," he'd bark. His crew was no better. Misfits, troublemakers, boys barely old enough to shave. The Navy didn't know what to do with them, so they dumped them here. But Jack saw something in their eyes. Fire. They didn't care about medals or speeches. They just wanted to survive. That made them dangerous. And that made them perfect. The first sub-encounter came on 20th of August, just a day after they were dispatched near the Mariana Trench. The sonar tech, a jittery kid named Hanks, nearly dropped his headphones when the blip appeared. It was quiet, subtle, but definitely moving. Jack didn't hesitate. Hard turn to port, drop the net, load depth charges. Other destroyers would have spent hours confirming. Jack didn't believe in waiting. He believed in instinct, and his gut was screaming. Moments later, they dropped 4 charges and waited. The explosion was muffled, deep, but followed by a gurgling sound that no one mistook. A dying engine struggling underwater. Then came the oil. Thick, black, floating to the surface like blood. Submarine 1. Confirmed kill. But it wasn't just luck. On 23rd of August, they picked up another contact. This one was smarter. It dove hard and fast, circling back in a strange pattern. Jack smiled. "They think we're stupid." He ordered silence on deck. Then he cut the engines. For 10 minutes, the ship drifted. Most commanders would have panicked, thinking they'd lost the target. But Jack knew predators always came back for a second look. When it did, the Rattlesnake came alive like a beast unleashed. Sonar confirmed the sub was right beneath them. Jack shouted, "Full spread!" They dropped everything. 6 charges hit the water like thunder. A second explosion erupted below, bigger than the first. Another submarine gone. Word began to spread. Unofficially, of course. No one at the command wanted to admit that the Navy's smallest destroyer was suddenly leading the scoreboard. Bigger ships were failing. Convoys were still getting hit. But somehow, Jack and his misfit crew were making the ocean safer. By 26th of August, they had sunk 2 more. One was caught attempting to launch torpedoes at a transport ship. The other had been hiding near a reef. Each time, Jack showed a level of aggression that bordered on reckless. But it worked. His crew began to believe. They stopped caring about size. They stopped fearing the deep. Instead, the ocean began to fear them. The Japanese command took notice. They began to suspect the Rattlesnake had some kind of new technology, maybe even British sonar. How else could such a tiny vessel outmaneuver their finest submarines? But it wasn't tech. It was rage, guts, and a captain who refused to back down. The turning point came on 29th of August, when they encountered a wolf pack, 3 subs working in tandem. The Navy would have normally sent an entire fleet to deal with that. Jack grinned and said, "We'll make do." And they did. The Rattlesnake cut through the water like a bullet, her hull vibrating as she charged toward the most dangerous moment of her short-lived career. A wolf pack, 3 enemy submarines, operating in tandem, a tactic feared by even the most seasoned American fleets. These weren't your average lone hunters. They worked in coordinated strikes, luring destroyers into traps, circling like sharks, then going for the kill. But Jack Weller wasn't the kind of man who ran from sharks. He fed them depth charges. It was late evening on 29th of August, skies bruised with storm clouds, the sea churning under the first hints of wind. Visibility was dropping fast. Any sane captain would have pulled back, radioed for reinforcements, or at the very least, waited for daylight. Jack didn't blink. "Light the deck," he ordered. "Full noise. Let's let 'em know we're here." The crew stared at him for a beat, stunned. Lighting up the ship was suicide in submarine country. It was like painting a target on your back and daring them to take a shot. But that was exactly what Jack wanted. "These bastards don't know we're not scared," he said with a grin. "Time to change that." With floodlights cutting through the fog and the engines rumbling like thunder, the Rattlesnake announced itself to the predators beneath. It wasn't long before the first torpedo came, slicing through the waves, screaming its arrival. "Right side! Evasive!" the lookout yelled. The Rattlesnake swerved, hard. A second later, the torpedo shot past the hull, close enough to feel the heat of its wake. Then another came, from the port side. Jack didn't flinch. "Now!" he barked. They'd been watching the sonar, tracking shadows. He knew exactly where the second sub was hiding, deep to the left, trying to flank them while the first distracted. Rattlesnake dumped a cluster of depth charges like a storm of fire into the water. The sea exploded. Steel groaned somewhere below. Bubbles surged up like a geyser, thick with oil and debris. The crew let out a roar. 1 down. Again. But there was no time to celebrate. The third sub fired, this time from a blind spot they hadn't expected. The torpedo struck the rear. A glancing blow, but enough to rock the Rattlesnake sideways. Alarms blared. Sparks flew from the engine room. A pipe burst, spraying steam. "We're hit, Captain!" someone screamed. Jack grabbed the railing, teeth clenched. Then we hit back harder. With part of their propulsion damaged, they couldn't outmaneuver. So he did the unthinkable. He ordered full steam ahead, straight toward the sonar contact. The crew thought he'd lost it. But Jack wasn't aiming to dodge. He was gambling. He knew that subs, when faced with a charging destroyer, either dove deeper or panicked. This one panicked. The sonar ping caught it rising, trying to reposition, trying to escape, and right above it, the Rattlesnake dumped her last 5 charges. A gamble with no backup plan. The blast was immediate. A deafening boom from beneath the surface that sent a fountain of seawater sky high. Bits of metal pierced the waves. The entire ship shook. And then came silence. 3 submarines. In one night, the crew stood on deck, soaked, bleeding, some injured, others cheering. No one could believe what they had done. The Japanese wolf pack had been shredded by a destroyer, half the size of a football field, leaking steam, held together with duct tape and raw anger. Radio silence was broken the next day. A message from command. "Did you confirm all 3 kills?" Jack replied only. "Count the oil." By 31st of August, Rattlesnake was limping toward a refueling station, half of her systems fried. but spirits sky high. They'd been mocked when they left port. A joke ship, a last-chance crew. But now, they were legends. And the sea, that cold, brutal sea, had learned a new name to fear. The Rattlesnake limped into Midway Station on 1st September 1944, her hull dented, engine coughing, paint scorched from the fight with the wolf pack. She looked like hell. But she came back with 3 kills. Verified, confirmed, undeniable. No one in the Pacific Theater could ignore it now. Command didn't welcome them with medals or fanfare. They welcomed them with silence. Then came the whispers. 3 submarines in one night? That little rust bucket? Must have been luck. No way they do it again. Even among their own ranks, envy started to bleed into the praise. The Navy didn't like outliers, especially ones that made the bigger ships look bad. Jack Weller knew it. He'd seen it in their eyes when he was summoned to the makeshift war room on base. Rear Admiral Connors sat at the table, puffing on a cigar, barely looking up as Jack entered. "You boys have been busy," Connors muttered. Jack stood straight, still in his grease-stained uniform. "Just doing the job, sir." Connors blew smoke, not impressed. "You embarrassed some very expensive ships out there. Got a few captains calling your methods reckless. Care to explain?" Jack smiled. "You send us out to kill subs, we kill subs. If they'd like us to stop, we can head back to port." There was a long pause. Connors stared at him, then gave a thin, bitter grin. "No, you're going back out." Jack's smile faded. "You're sending us again?" "The ship's damaged. Half the crew's patched with morphine." Connors leaned forward. "We'll patch your hull just enough to float. That's all you get. You're heading to Sector 7, the Devil's Pocket. It's where we've lost 4 destroyers in the last 2 weeks. Subs own that stretch of ocean. You want to prove you're more than just a lucky shot? Go clean it up." Jack knew what this was. It wasn't a mission. It was a setup. They wanted the Rattlesnake to go down. Quietly. Problem solved. He returned to the ship that night, rage simmering in his gut. The crew was resting, drinking bad coffee, patching leaks with duct tape and stolen engine parts. He called them to the deck. Didn't sugarcoat it. "They're sending us to the Devil's Pocket," he said. "It's a death trap." One of the sailors, Jenkins, laughed nervously. "So, when do we refuse?" Jack stared at him. "We don't. We go." There was silence. No complaints. Not one man stepped back. These weren't Navy men anymore. Not in the traditional sense. They weren't fighting for stars or stripes. They were fighting for each other, for respect, for revenge against a system that kept counting them out. They left the next morning, patched up, fueled up, held together by willpower and sheer defiance. The ship groaned as it left the dock, but it sailed. September. They entered Devil's Pocket under a sky bruised black. The sea unusually still. A predator's stillness. Sonar was eerily quiet. No chatter, no fish. Just the deep, humming silence of something waiting. Then, out of nowhere, ping, a single sonar contact, followed by 4 more. They were surrounded. Hanks, the sonar tech, whispered, "Sir, I think they've been waiting for us." Jack didn't blink. Then let's not keep them disappointed. No backup, no cover. Just them. The first sub struck at 800 hours, a long-range torpedo skimming the water, aimed straight at their bow. Jack swerved early, not because he saw it, but because he knew it was coming. It missed, barely. Depth charges dropped instantly. Another contact broke. Oil spilled. 1 down, but this time the subs didn't scatter. They closed in. 2 torpedoes, one from each side. Jack screamed, "Brace!" One hit the stern, a direct hit. The crew was tossed like rag dolls. Alarms shrieked. Fire erupted in the engine room, smoke filled the decks. Screams rang out. Blood slicked the metal floors. But Jack climbed back to his feet, blood running down his forehead, and shouted, "Don't stop firing! This ship doesn't die today." They kept fighting, half blind, half sinking, and then, miracle. A sub breached the surface, forced up by their relentless charge. A rare mistake by the enemy. One of the gunners, barely conscious, fired the cannon straight through the sub's command deck. Explosion. Metal tore into the sky. Water surged. Another down. 2 left. The Rattlesnake was barely afloat. Engines dead. Deck in flames. Water rushing in from the stern. But the crew, those misfits, kept fighting like demons. And Jack Weller, he stood on that burning deck, coat soaked in blood and oil, yelling into the fog like a madman, "Is that all you've got?" The Rattlesnake was dying. Smoke rose from her shattered hull like a funeral pyre. Fire gnawed at the aft deck, licking the gun mounts as sailors scrambled with extinguishers and bare hands to beat back the flames. The engine room was flooded waist-deep. Below deck, pumps screamed and coughed, trying to keep the ship from slipping under. But she refused to sink. She couldn't. Not while 2 enemy submarines still stalked the water around them. The crew was half dead, bloodied and burnt, faces blackened with soot. Jenkins had a tourniquet on his leg, shrapnel embedded in his thigh. Hanks had a broken wrist and kept manning the sonar with his good hand. The radio was gone, fried in the blast. They couldn't call for help even if they wanted to, but none of them asked to retreat. Jack Weller stood on what was left of the bridge, looking more like a ghost than a man. His uniform torn, left eye swollen shut, arm in a makeshift sling. But his voice, still sharp. "Still loud! Listen up! We've got no power, no engines, and barely a rudder. But we've still got teeth," he shouted. "They think we're finished. So let's make 'em come finish it." And that's exactly what he wanted. The remaining 2 subs were out there, circling, watching, waiting for the Rattlesnake to slip beneath the waves. Standard Japanese Navy doctrine dictated that after a hit like that, they'd back off and wait for nature to finish the job. But Jack knew better. He knew their kind. He'd studied them. Japanese sub-commanders were prideful. They didn't want nature to win. They wanted the kill shot, the trophy, the confirmation. So Jack turned the crippled Rattlesnake into bait. He ordered all remaining floodlights turned off. Let the fire glow. Let the black smoke rise high into the sky. Let the ship look like a dying carcass. He even had the crew stop the pumps, briefly, to let her lean deeper into the water, like a dying whale. Then he had the last functioning torpedo reloaded manually. No targeting system, no lock-on, just aim and hope. They waited in silence. For nearly 3 hours, nothing. And then, periscope sighted, barely a glint, a shimmer against the waterline. A hunter rising for the kill. Jack didn't wait. Fire. The torpedo launched with a sick mechanical groan, the sound of a ship that had nothing left to give. The crew held their breath. They couldn't track it, couldn't correct course. It was either dumb luck or death. 10 seconds. 20. Then, boom! The sea cracked open. The explosion was so close, the Rattlesnake tilted from the shock wave. A cheer broke out from the starboard side. The enemy sub had surfaced just long enough to confirm the kill, and got itself blown sky-high instead. One left. Jack fell to one knee, exhausted, spitting blood, smiling. "One more bastard," he whispered. But now, the final sub knew the trap. It wasn't going to surface. It wouldn't play that game. This one was smarter, and it was angry. They didn't know it until the sonar pinged one last time, a fast-moving contact. coming in from below, not to fire a torpedo, but to ram. That was new? Brace. Jack screamed. Too late. The impact tore through the underside of the rattlesnake like a jagged blade. The ship heaved, steel shrieking as metal met metal. The Japanese sub had made a desperate, suicidal move, trying to drag the rattlesnake down with it. The hull split open. Water rushed in. The rattlesnake groaned. Slowly, finally, the stern began to dip into the ocean. But something unexpected happened. The enemy sub, in trying to sink them, had surfaced. Briefly, its conning tower breached for a split second, barely 300 yards away, and Jenkins, bleeding, half-conscious, on one leg, was still manning the main gun. "Give me the shot," he whispered. Nobody stopped him. He aimed, fired. The shell hit the sub clean, right through its exposed tower. Final explosion, final kill, final breath. Silence returned to the Devil's Pocket. 4 submarines in less than 2 days, 6 in total. The smallest destroyer in the Navy had done the unthinkable. As the Rattlesnake finally began to sink, Jack stood tall. No panic, no fear, just pride. He turned to his crew, what remained of them, and said with a cracked voice, "Well, boys, we gave 'em hell. The sea took the Rattlesnake that night, but legends don't drown." Debris floated across the blood-warm waters of the Devil's Pocket. Pieces of the Rattlesnake, her charred hull, splintered decking, and burned life rings, drifted quietly under the bruised September sky. But death hadn't claimed everyone, miraculously. 12 crewmen survived, clinging to broken planks, life jackets, even the wreckage of a destroyed torpedo casing. They waited, barely conscious, lungs stinging from smoke and salt. Among them was Jack Weller, propped against a floating oil drum, his body half submerged, his mouth bleeding, but his grip still iron-tight on a splintered rail. He wasn't going to die here. Not after everything. The survivors drifted for 2 full days, sunburned, dehydrated, some slipping in and out of hallucinations. A few cursed, a few prayed. One sang a broken verse of "God Bless America" between sobs. Sharks circled once and left, almost as if the sea, in some strange way, respected them too much to feed. On 6th of September, a scout plane, patrolling far beyond its designated zone, spotted the oil slick. It dipped low, saw a single figure wave. The Navy rescue ship that arrived later almost didn't believe the report. 12 men, covered in burns, starving, floating in a graveyard of steel and silence, but alive. When the rescue crew hauled Jack aboard, the first thing he said, blood running from his lip, was, "Did we get that last son of a bitch?" The medic nodded. "Aye, Captain. You got him." Jack passed out with a smile. Back at Pearl Harbor, word of the Rattlesnake's last stand traveled fast, and not through official channels. The Navy tried to bury it at first. The report was filed as engagement with multiple submarines, outcome uncertain. The kind of vague, bureaucratic summary that said nothing and hoped everyone forgot. But sailors talk. And by the time the survivors were flown in, reporters were already sniffing around. One photo, just one, of Jack Weller being wheeled off a transport plane, arm in a sling, face like a battlefield, became the spark. Tiny ship, Titanic fight. The headline read, "It spread like wildfire." Suddenly, every man in uniform wanted to know the truth about the destroyer that fought off a wolf pack and refused to die. The legend of the Rattlesnake began, not from the Navy, but from the mouths of those who'd been ignored, discarded, or mocked. Congress called for an inquiry. Veterans demanded medals. Even civilian papers on the mainland ran stories. 12 men and a ship that shamed the Japanese Navy. Smallest destroyer, biggest heart. The Navy had no choice. They held a quiet ceremony, closed to the public, gave Jack Weller the Navy Cross, posthumously, because they wrongly believed he'd died from his injuries a day after rescue. He hadn't. He woke up mid-ceremony in a hospital bed and cursed the press officer reading his eulogy. "Still breathing, you bureaucratic bastard," he muttered. He lived, and so did the memory of the rattlesnake. But what came next was even more unsettling. Japanese communications, intercepted weeks later, confirmed that the final sub killed by the rattlesnake had been one of their elite prototype stealth vessels, testing a new radar-resistant hull, a weapon that could have turned the tide. The Japanese Navy wasn't hunting convoys when they entered Devil's Pocket. They were hunting the rattlesnake. They had heard of her and sent a unit to erase the embarrassment, and failed. Weller's crew hadn't just fought for survival. They'd accidentally intercepted a classified operation and crushed it. The implications rattled the Pacific theater. Orders changed. Strategy shifted. Confidence surged, all because a broken-down rust bucket with 12 survivors punched a hole in Japan's pride. Jack was never reassigned. He was offered a desk job, a quiet retirement. Behind command walls, he refused. "They'll name a ship after the rattlesnake one day," he said. "Until then, I'll train boys to fight like we did. Not by the book, but by guts." Years later, they did name a ship after her, USS Rattlesnake the Sutter. Tidu. Larger, stronger, but still bearing the insignia of the original. A fanged serpent wrapped around a torpedo, and beneath it, etched into steel, the words, "Size be damned." Jack Weller didn't retire. He could have. After the sinking of the original rattlesnake, after the ceremony, after the headlines and parades, he had every right to hang up the uniform and disappear into a quiet life. They even offered him a nice pension, a house in California, a folded flag in a shadow box, and a speech by a man who'd never set foot on a warship. He turned it all down. Instead, he walked into the Naval Warfare Training Center in San Diego on a cane, his leg still healing, and told the commanding officer, "I'm here to teach your boys how to kill submarines." The admiral looked at him like he was mad, but Jack wasn't asking. Within a month, he had a new assignment: training sub-killer squads. Young sailors, barely through boot camp, were pulled into a program that didn't exist on paper. Jack's rules were simple: no fear, no waiting, and no damn protocol when you're about to die. His first group laughed at him, a few cracked jokes about the crazy cripple who thought yelling at torpedoes made them turn. By week 2, they stopped laughing. Jack trained them like animals, sleep-deprived, soaked in sea spray, running blind sonar drills at 2 a.m. with real depth-charge simulators. He had them firing blindfolded, repairing jammed guns underwater, and crawling through sinking compartment simulations. He wasn't training sailors. He was building Avengers, because Jack wasn't just preparing for the next fight. He was digging for the truth. He still remembered the cold way. Rear Admiral Connors had smiled when assigning them to Devil's Pocket. He remembered the ship's supply manifest missing key upgrades. He remembered how his request for sonar refits had been delayed due to budget constraints. All of it. Intentional. The Navy didn't expect them to come back, and Jack wanted to know why. It started with an offhand remark from a drunk officer at a bar near Coronado. Something about how much money Connors lost in that sonar contract bid. Jack didn't drink that night, but he listened. The pieces started to fall into place. Turns out, a massive private defense contractor had been lobbying Navy brass to delay the rollout of new anti-submarine sonar arrays. claiming they were not field-tested. But Jack had seen a prototype version on a British ship during convoy duty. It worked. It would have made the Rattlesnake a whole different beast. Connors had delayed the install on certain ships, including Jack's, claiming lack of reliability. But there was something worse. He had funneled funding away from less strategic assets. Jack Weller's ship had been considered one of them. A test, a sacrifice. Let them go down and use their failure to justify billions in new contracts. But Jack didn't fail. He ruined the plan by winning. And now, the bastards were pretending like they'd always believed in him. Jack compiled the evidence quietly, spoke with technicians, found memos. One brave clerk from Naval Logistics even snuck him internal emails. It was all there. Procurement fraud, negligence, and a cold-blooded strategy to let men die so the Navy could get the toys it wanted. He didn't trust the chain of command, so he took it straight to the media, and the media remembered who he was. The headline dropped like a hammer. Hero Captain claims Navy, let Rattlesnake die. Exposes cover-up. The story exploded. Congressional hearings followed. Admiral Connors denied everything, but the memos didn't lie. His retirement was expedited, quietly, with a pension cut in half. No apology, no admission, just a power player knocked off his throne. But Jack didn't need revenge. He'd already won. Back at the training center, the recruits started calling him Ghost Fang, half in jest, half in awe. His legend grew. He turned misfits into destroyer tacticians, dropouts into depth-charge hunters. In 1946, a new destroyer was commissioned, USS Rattlesnake Thug. Chudu, sleek, modern, deadly. Jack was offered the command. He refused. I already had my ship, he said. She went down fighting. Instead, he handed the command to Lieutenant Monroe, one of his best trainees, a kid from Mississippi who, 3 years ago, couldn't tell port from starboard. Now he led anti-submarine patrols in the South Pacific, and every enemy sonar feared the hiss of the Rattlesnake II's approach. Jack stood on the dock, watching the new ship glide into the horizon. Then he turned and walked back to the training yard, cane in one hand, dossier in the other, a new batch of recruits waiting to be turned into ghosts. Because legends don't rest. They build more legends. A new war was brewing. Not the kind with flags and declarations, but the quiet, crawling kind, shadows beneath waves, secrets whispered in sealed bunkers, and dead men floating without a country to blame. The Cold War had begun. And somewhere in the disputed waters near the Paracel Islands, American intelligence had gone dark. 3 patrol subs, silent. No distress calls, no survivors. Just static. The Navy didn't send a fleet. They sent a ghost, USS Rattlesnake the Sind, with a crew trained by one man, Jack Weller. Lieutenant Cole Monroe stood on the bridge, rain slicing sideways across his face. He was barely 30, but scars already lined his knuckles and jaw. Trained by Weller, forged in fire, and now commanding a ship carrying the weight of legend. They were tracking a whisper, an unidentified sub, deep-diving in American-monitored territory, vanishing like smoke every time sonar lit up. No signature, no flag. Not even Japanese or Soviet tech matched it. Jack Weller, now 52, wasn't on board. But he was watching from the Naval Intelligence Command in Okinawa. He'd been pulled in under special clearance after rumors leaked that the enemy sub might not be Soviet, or at least not entirely Soviet. It was something else, something experimental. Back aboard the Rattlesnake II, things got worse fast. On the 3rd day of patrol, sonar picked up a signal. 200 meters below, gliding without noise, then suddenly gone. The team called it a ghost glide, a signature unlike anything they'd ever tracked. Monroe ordered silence. Full radio blackout. He suspected the sub could intercept even scrambled transmissions. Then, late that night, the ship shuddered. Not from a hit, from pressure. The depth beneath them had changed. The seafloor was rising, rapidly. But no charts showed such terrain. It wasn't a mountain, it was metal. A massive submerged structure. Holy hell, the sonar tech whispered. Sir, that's no reef. That's a dry dock. Underwater. The realization sank like a weight in Monroe's gut. The enemy sub wasn't hunting them. It was coming home, to a secret underwater base hidden in plain sight. It was an ambush. In Okinawa, Jack Weller stared at the intel reports, veins pulsing in his temple. A base that size didn't just pop up. Someone knew. Someone let it happen. He dug deeper, and what he found chilled him. The underwater base was part of a rogue project, an unapproved American black op called Echo Dusk. Back in '48, a splinter unit of U.S. Naval Command had partnered with X-Axis engineers to build hybrid submarines, fusing German stealth designs with stolen Soviet sonar encryption. It was illegal, buried, disbanded, or so they claimed. Now, one of those submarines had gone rogue, captained by a former recruit of Weller's Commander Felix Hart. Discharged dishonorably in 1947 for extreme conduct and insubordination. But that wasn't the whole story. Jack remembered the kid, brilliant, cold, and fascinated with power. Hart had always wanted more than a ship. He wanted a legacy, and now he had one, built in the shadows. On the Rattlesnake II, sonar exploded with activity. Torpedoes, 4 of them, incoming. Evasive. Full turn, Monroe shouted. The ship dove hard, narrowly avoiding 2. The third struck a glancing blow. The fourth missed, barely. Depth charges were dropped, but they were useless. This sub was too fast, too silent, and too deep. It was like trying to punch a shadow underwater. Then came the message. Shortwave, piggybacking off their sonar frequency, not from the Navy, not from allies, but from Felix Hart himself. I learned from the best, Monroe. Let's see if you inherited his courage, or just his name. Jack. Weller slammed his fist against the table. They weren't just facing a rogue sub. They were facing his ghost, twisted and weaponized. The Navy wanted to launch a full-scale assault. Jack stopped them. Felix trained with us. He thinks like us. But I made that boy. I know where he'll hide, how he'll fight, and where he'll fail. You send a fleet, he disappears. You send me, we end it. 2 days later, Jack Weller, against all regulation, stepped aboard a stealth-equipped destroyer called USS Nightshade, manned by former Rattlesnake trainees, men who still called him Ghost Fang. He was going back to sea. One final time, not to hunt a sub, but to face a man he once called Son. The sea was black. No moon, no stars. Just waves slapping the hull of USS Nightshade, a sleek, sonar-dead destroyer outfitted with classified tech and a crew that didn't officially exist. Jack Weller stood on the bridge, his face weathered, expression stone-cold, and a suppressed fury behind his eyes. It wasn't the mission that haunted him, it was Felix Hart, the boy he had trained, the prodigy with perfect instincts and zero conscience. Weller had seen the darkness in him back in '46. He'd tried to burn it out through pressure, drills, and raw discipline. But Hart didn't crack. He just hid it better. Until the day he was dishonorably discharged for disobeying direct orders and nearly causing the sinking of an Allied sub during a joint exercise. Weller never saw him again. Now, the student had become the threat, and he was hiding in a ghost base beneath the waves. A sub of monstrous design, The Leviathan class, born from stolen tech and treason. Built for one purpose: dominate underwater warfare. Felix had weaponized everything Jack taught him, but Jack knew something Felix didn't. Jack wasn't done learning. Below the surface, 400 meters deep, the rogue sub Nocturne drifted like a silent predator, engines humming at a pitch that didn't show on standard sonar. Felix's heart stood in the command chamber, eyes cold, calm, hands folded behind his back. USS Nightshade has entered Grid Echo 9, his tactical officer said. They're sweeping with low-frequency sonar. Minimal spread, Felix smirked. That's Jack, always cautious. He'll want to talk before he kills, the officer hesitated. Should we fire, Commander? Felix turned slowly. Not yet. Let him come closer. Let him think he's still teaching the class. Midnight. Jack Weller sat in the Nightshade's war room, staring at a sonar map that didn't blink. No movement. No echoes. Nothing. But he knew. He's down there, he whispered, sitting still. Just like I taught him. No panic. No trail. Ensign Ramos, the sonar tech, young, fast-thinking, looked confused. Sir, no contact. Are we sure he's not deeper? Jack leaned over him. He's above us. Ramos blinked. Sir? Jack jabbed a finger on the map. That base was never about hiding deeper. It was about floating above blind spots. Our sonar's looking too far down. He's right in our shadow zone. Seconds later, ping! Contact. 200 meters. Directly ahead. Jack slammed the intercom. Target acquired. Load depth barrels. Full pattern! A sailor shouted back. Sir, too close! If we drop now, we risk blowback. Jack grinned. Then don't miss. The ocean exploded. 4 depth charges launched like hammers into the sea. 2 hit nothing, but the third caught the Nocturne just as it banked to dive. A violent shockwave tore across its starboard side. Not enough to kill, but enough to make Felix blink. For the first time, the Leviathan class trembled. Inside, alarms screamed. Officers scrambled. Felix shouted, "Evasive maneuver! Now!" But Weller wasn't chasing. He was guiding. The Nightshade had dropped sonar lures in a triangle pattern, subtle drifts of signal noise that confused Felix's readings. As he dove to escape, he dove into a kill box. Weller whispered to Ramos, "Now we hit him where he doesn't think we know." A new pattern of depth charges fired. But these weren't detonating on contact. They were timed. Smart. Jack had seen the Leviathan blueprints. The sub had a thermal vent at the rear, a weak spot covered by a fast-closing shield that only opened during speed boosts. He waited. Felix pushed the sub to full throttle, trying to outrun them. And then, boom, direct hit. The vent collapsed. Power flickered across the Nocturne. Inside, chaos. Felix staggered against the railing, smoke curling from sparking wires. "Surface!" he roared. His officers hesitated. "Sir, we'll be exposed." "I said surface!" The rogue sub lurched upward, and the moment it broke the surface, Jack was already waiting. On the deck of the Nightshade, floodlights snapped on, cannons rotated, and Jack stood at the bow, his old navy coat flapping in the wind, gray hair soaked in salt. A voice crackled over the radio. Felix Hart. "You finally caught up, old man." Jack didn't blink. "You never outran me, Felix. You just ran off the map. You trained me too well." "No. I trained you to know where the line is. You decided to cross it." There was a pause. Then Felix said, "So what now? You kill me? Become the legend again?" Jack raised the mic slowly. "You killed good men. You betrayed your oath. This isn't about legend. This is about justice." Felix laughed, cold and sharp. "Then do it." Jack gave the order. 2 precision missiles launched from the Nightshade, slicing through the sky like spears. One hit the conning tower. The other struck just below the waterline. The Nocturne exploded in a towering inferno. a monument of flame and steel in the dead of night. Silence followed. Jack stood alone as the wreckage burned behind him. Not proud, not relieved, just done. Back at the command center, the debrief was short. The file on Project Echo Dusk was finally opened and destroyed. Jack gave his testimony, dropped his badge, and walked out. No medals, no headlines, just peace and a final message left for his trainees. Don't become legends. Become the reason legends stop being necessary.